All right, we'll go ahead and get started so we can make the best use of our time together. Welcome to Integrating the Missouri River into Your Classroom. My name is Kristen Schulte, and assisting me today is Laura Waldo Semkin. Hi, everybody. We're so grateful that you're here today. This workshop is hosted by Missouri River Relief. We are a non-for-profit organization. We work the lower section of the Missouri River, so from about Yankton, South Dakota to St. Louis. Our mission is to connect people to the Missouri River. We do that by cruising around in these custom-made rides, 24-foot aluminum plate boats, and we host river cleanups, education programs, and also recreation events out on the Missouri River. Give me a hand raise if you've ever participated in one of our programs before. Oh, awesome. Wow, cool. That's great. Thanks, guys. So in the past 15 years that we've been hosting these programs, we've taken out over 27,000 people out onto the Missouri River, and they've helped remove 940 tons of trash over 1,200 miles of the Missouri River. I work as the education director, so I oversee all of the education programs. I've worked in environmental education for over 15 years. I've known from a very young age that environmental ed was a path that was for me. I actually really struggled in school with 2 learning disabilities. And so when I spent time outside, it was one of the only places where I really ever felt smart. And so I really gravitated towards those settings. And so the day after I graduated from high school, I started working for the National Park Service. And I proceeded to sort of sandwich working with the national park and then going to college for a semester, kind of back and forth. So in total, I've worked in 12 national parks across the country. I received my master's degree in natural resource education from Teton Science Schools, which is located in Grand Teton National Park. And I have certificates in field natural science teaching and place-based education. I want to thank everybody for participating today and for your interest. I know that your time is really valuable during these challenging times. So if you need to do anything to take care of yourself or multitask doing this, like eating lunch, please feel free to do that. I hope that out of the next 75 minutes, this workshop grants you some type of normalcy in your life that maybe hasn't been too familiar lately, and inspiration towards thinking about the future and what next school year looks like, wrapped up in all the other things that are also on our mind. So during this workshop, I will be presenting information at an adult learning level versus a student level. And it's your responsibility to translate the context of this workshop to what fits your students best, because you know them, better than we do. And I want you to get the most out of this workshop as possible. So I'm going to recommend that you think about it in a couple different contexts. One, as if you're teaching the material to your students. 2, as if you're teaching the material to your peers or fellow teachers. I mean, even like maybe your dinner conversation that you might have this evening. And then also as if you were in my shoes, if you were teaching this information, if you were teaching the workshop itself. So the more perspectives that you can have, the more meaningful this time that you spend with us will be. Because it's very easy to sort of say, I couldn't do this, or I, don't necessarily have the space in the curriculum to do this right now. But I think the more context you can think about it, the more you can walk away from it. So lastly, there are a lot of stories that the Missouri River can tell. And today we're mostly going to be focusing on the idea of that the Missouri River has changed over time. And we'll focus on the NGSS standards that are found under Life Science 2, Ecosystems, Interactions, Energy, and Dynamics. And we'll place an emphasis on observing and analyzing biotic and abiotic factors in the ecosystem and the effects that these have on populations. We'll also be integrating NGSS practices such as observation, analyzation, modeling, and discussion. Now, kind of after saying all of that, I feel really intimidated, but I think that we can do this together. And maybe this will also kind of give you an idea of, how brief some aspects of the NGSS practice can be, and kind of lessen the intimidation that comes along with some of these when you first start biting into it. So if you'd like to grab a pen and paper, now would be a good time to do so. We will use that a little bit later in the workshop. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. It can just be a scratch paper. So for those of you that might be new to Zoom, few things to point out. In the top right corner, you can switch between speaker and gallery view. On the lower left corner, you can mute your audio and video. In the bottom or top of your screen, and it might be hidden, so you might have to scan over the top of it, you can chat with everyone or send a private message. In that same bar, you can give us a thumbs up, or you can also do that on your video. You can also raise your hand. And then on your video that you can see of yourself, in the top right corner is 3 dots. If you click that, you can edit your name, you can use a pronoun if you'd like, and then it might also be helpful to add your grade level. It depends on how long your name is and how much we can squeeze onto that little bar. So let's get started. We're going to take a wide view of the Missouri River with a map of its watershed. This is the longest river in North America at 2,341 miles long. It includes portions of 10 states and drains 1/6 of the United States. It's considered the center of life for the Great Plains. The Missouri River has served as the main artery for exploration, for food, trade, transportation for millions of people over thousands of years. And about 1/4 of all the agricultural land in the United States is found in the Missouri River watershed, which provides 1/3 of the country's wheat, flax, barley, and oats. It's significant to Native culture, past and current. Its significance cannot be overstated. The Missouri River provides drinking water to 2.5 million people, with a total of 43% of Missourians getting their water from the Missouri River, and it's critical to habitat for fish and wildlife. And then it's right in your own backyards. It literally flows straight through Kansas City. So that's the end of Missouri River Geography 101. A lot of people get a little confused when we say Missouri River. It's easy to think Missouri's rivers, but we mean the Missouri River. So often in science, we ask students to look harder to make observations. And it's easy to assume that everyone sees the same thing when we're studying the landscape or looking at a photo. I want to ask you guys a question here. And this is going to be my first stab at being interactive across a virtual platform. So you'll have to unmute yourself from one of the top or bottom corners. But I want to ask you first, who do you think are exceptional observers?
Scientists.
Young kids.
Young kids.
Young kids, yep.
Children.
Artists.
Artists. I was thinking about sports players, like football or baseball players. Next question. What makes some observers better than others?
Curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Attention to detail.
Yeah.
Purpose.
Say that again, Laura?
Purpose? Like, if you feel like there's a purpose to why you're looking at something,
Mm-hmm.
like, you have a goal or something.
Yeah. Like if it's your job.
I think
Yeah.
I think they can see the forest and the trees, and neither, they see both the big picture and the details.
Mm-hmm. So Sherlock Holmes, who is a fictional character, is quoted with, you know, I see no more than you, but I have trained myself to notice what I see. And observation is a skill. It takes practice. And in this workshop, I'm going to show you some tricks to help you and your students become better observers and notice things that often other people do not. So now the Missouri River has not always looked like that first photo that I've showed you. This is a painting of the Missouri River by George Catlin in 1832, and this is near modern-day Sioux City, Iowa. And we're going to practice just our skill of observation with this painting. And observation is something that we notice with our senses. You know, virtually we're kind of limited to sight, but often you can use touch and smell and hearing and taste with caution. And I know I'm making an observation when I begin a sentence with, I notice. So I want you to take a look at this painting, and I want you to say out loud, and unmute yourself, of course, some things that you notice.
Islands.
Yeah, small islands. Yep.
Yeah,
Hills.
small islands in the middle.
Hills on the sides.
And not many trees.
Not many trees.
Notice that nothing's really straight. There's a lot of curves.
A lot of green.
Yeah, not very green.
I noticed, you know, the perspective here. That's very wide. So what you've noticed in this painting is what many Native people and the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark's expedition, experienced when they were traveling the Missouri River. And it wasn't until 1819 that the steamboat Independence departed St. Louis, Missouri, and steamed upriver. This was the very first steamboat to travel on the Missouri River, and eventually pioneered steamboat travel, being the primary vehicle for carrying supplies and passengers upstream. Now Kansas City has a really unique geology history, and there is a rock ledge that's located near Riverfront Park. You can only see it from either the river or the opposite side of the river. And this rock ledge jets out into the river and was a place where steamboats could pull up to the bank and unload goods. And this was particularly helpful because of how muddy the banks of the Missouri River were. It was also something reliable, which was not something that the Missouri River often presented to steamboat travel. Now, because you have this place where folks are able to unload and their goods and materials, it gave birth to the city itself. And so people started cutting out man-made canyons through the bluffs that we saw in that first painting, and they created sort of a grid system. Now, you might be wondering, well, where are all these bluffs now? And there are definitely some still present around Kansas City that you might notice while driving along the highways. But most of this material was used to build the city itself. That sediment was really helpful for new construction and starting sort of a foundation. So literally, parts of Kansas City are built on sediment from the bluffs around the Missouri River itself. Now, the Missouri River was a very dangerous place to travel, and many steamboats sank. And over a 30-year period, about 600 boats in total lost or were shipwrecked. And what we're looking at here is a map of some of those boats around St. Louis. So you can see how this map leads into the Mississippi River right in here. And each of these green and red dots are places where a boat sank. Total, out of those 600 boats that were on the Missouri River, 400 of them sank. 2 of those boats, so that means like 2 out of every 3 boats found its resting spot on the bottom of the Missouri River. Now, during the 20th century, the Missouri River Basin was extensively developed, and this was for irrigation of agricultural land, for flood control, for generation of hydroelectrical power, and for navigation. The purpose of the bank stabilization and navigation project was to create a 9-foot by 30-foot wide navigation channel. And in this picture, you can see that there are men here building something called a wing dike. And this is a man-made barrier that is unlike a conventional dam. So it only extends partway into the channel of the river, and these structures force the water into a faster moving channel, which reduces the rate of sediment accumulating in the main channel. It slows the water closest to the bank down. So that's sort of how these wing dikes work. And in a little bit here, I'll sort of show you how this works in action. So besides creating that navigation channel, they also stabilized the bank. And they did this through willow mats. And this is by far one of my favorite photos because of just the sheer size of these willows. So if you take into account that the people standing on top of the willow barge are, full-grown men, and then that they're passing on a bundle of willow trees down below, and then people are individually weaving these willow trees into a mat. Can you raise your hand if you sew or knit or crochet? Okay, can just imagine doing that with trees. I don't claim to have either of those talents, much less with trees itself. And they did this for miles on miles, stabilizing the bank of the river. And they would interchange willow mats and also like brick and stone, sort of layering it like masonry work. So those 2 things, those 2 structures help channelize the river. And they did this for navigation. And I'm going to show you a series of photos of how these structures worked over time. So an important thing to remember here is the date of the photo, which is in the bottom right corner. Can anybody tell me some things that they noticed from this photo?
Lots of sandbars.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got some sandbars or islands in the middle of the photo. How would you describe the river?
Very wide.
Mm-hmm. So this is September 1934. November 1934, so same year. We've got the first construction of wing dikes. You can see they're currently building them. The river is very wide. There's a lot of islands still. June 1935, so a couple more months ahead, but it's the following year. What do you notice about the wing dikes?
They're filling in.
They're filling in.
They're really wide. If you look at like how wide the river is, the wing dikes take up like 2/3 of the river.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So keep your eye on those wing dikes. October 1935. So you've got more sediment that's building up behind those wing dikes. Remember how I said earlier that the wing dikes force the river into a faster moving channel, and as a result, that water rate slows down. So same exact thing as if I were to take a jar of water filled full of dirt and I were to shake it all up, set it down on the counter, all that sediment, because the water stopped moving, would drop out of the water. That's exactly what's happening behind the wing dikes. Now, there are is a dark patch that's on the sediment here. I want you to keep your eye on that. August 1936. That dark patch is actually vegetation. And you have plants that are growing up here because it's open, fertile sediment. Now, what do you notice the river doing?
Straightening.
That's straightening. It's shifted completely to one side. These wing dikes are very much doing their job. Huge leap forward in time, 1946. So this is about 10 years difference. And do you remember where those wing dikes first started out? They're not gone. They have been grown over the top of with trees and vegetation. And then 1977, fast forward in time, we have early agricultural practices of farming all the way up to the river's edge. The river went from being very wide, very shallow, to now very narrow and very deep. What are some things that you wonder as a result of the wing dikes and bank stabilization?
Well, how deep the main channel has become.
Mm-hmm.
What effect did it have on the wildlife?
Yeah.
What about floods? Is the flooding worse?
Mm.
Who owns that land?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, I wonder who took all these pictures, if they knew the intent when they started photographing. So what we just used to sort of look at these photos is something called I Notice, I Wonder, and they're sentence starters. They're really easy to integrate into a lot of aspects. And often I'm a really firm believer in investing some time on the front end to be able to use tools on the back end over and over and over in the classroom. Sort of thinking about how you can build that culture of your students. Now, another really great sentence starter to pair with this is it reminds me of. And it reminds me of, we won't have time for today, but it reminds me of speaks to the connection and speaks to connecting back to prior knowledge. And often it's helpful to connect back to that prior knowledge because it makes for learning to be a little bit deeper and a little bit stickier. So I'm going to provide this lesson plan for you. It's actually from the Lawrence Hall of Science, the Beetles Project, and has been really helpful throughout my own teaching. And I've seen teachers do a lot of really creative things with it. So I really appreciate your guys' engagement with it. And I hope you had a little bit of fun with it. So part of the bank stabilization and navigation structures was also the construction of dams. And these dams assisted with navigation and flood control, but also hydroelectricity power. And this is the dam that is on the upper stretch of the Missouri River. There are 7 dams total that impound the main branch, the main stem of the river, with hundreds more on tributaries. So these dams have provided the lower Missouri River Valley with high productive agriculture and industry in an industrial region. Because of these structures though, and this heavy development, it has had consequences. Mark Twain is often credited with the quote, "The Missouri River too thick to drink and too thin to plow." And this has a lot to do with the high sediment load. When we take 4th graders out on the Missouri River, they're always asking us, why does the Missouri River look like chocolate milk? And that sounds pretty good most of the time. But that has to do with the high sediment load that's in the water. So that sediment is suspended throughout the river. The majority of it comes from the high plains and also the Rocky Mountain region. Now, the sediment load has really changed over time, although it'd be really hard to tell by just looking at it because it still looks just as muddy. What we're looking at is a graph of sediment from past to present. So this first graph that we're looking at is suspended sediment discharge in millions of metric tons per year. So you have a map that's sort of following the path of the river in the watershed. And you can see it starts at the top, runs through Montana, comes down through Nebraska and Iowa, and then it hits Kansas City, or it hits St. Louis and then meets up with the Mississippi River. Now the Mississippi River often gets called the Big Muddy too, but in all honesty, it's only the Big Muddy because of the amount of sediment dumping in from the Missouri River. So you see at the top here, the Missouri River the Mississippi River has very little sediment that is actually joining into the Missouri River historically. So this in turn is then dumping into the Gulf of Mexico, which is 400 metric tons of sediment per year. Essentially, the Missouri River built the state of Louisiana with the amount of sediment that would run off of the high plains and the Rocky Mountain region. So if we take a look at this same sediment graph with navigation structures and the installation of dams, we can see that sediment load has drastically changed. So we have the Missouri River again with less sediment joining in throughout the watershed, it dumping into the Mississippi River. And then we have the Mississippi River actually having a little bit more sediment here, probably because of development. And the same with the Ohio River. And it dumps into the Gulf of Mexico at around 150 to 200 million metric tons per year. So this is almost about half of the sediment load from the Missouri River that has just disappeared. Sorry. I should also add that the sediment load has disappeared because it has been trapped behind the dams itself. So from channelization, from the dams, meanders in the Missouri River and islands have been cut off to improve navigation and in total reduced the length of the river by 200 miles. These drastic alterations have impacted wildlife, such as these 3 endangered species. We have the pallid sturgeon, who relies on shallow water habitat. Then we have the least interior tern and the piping plover, a little bit cuter than this dinosaur-looking fish here. And these 2 birds rely on sandbars and islands for nesting habitat. So sadly, these types of habitat are far and few between, but there has been a fair amount of restoration efforts to increase places for nesting and for breeding. So to understand the relationship that the Missouri River shares with the land, I want you to go ahead and take out your piece of paper and pen or pencil, and I want you to go ahead and draw a food web of the Missouri River. And you can draw with images, or you can just use words. The important thing here is I want you to connect the energy flow of the things in your food web. So on this slide is just a picture of some of the things you might incorporate. Just a little bit of time to do this.
Kristen, could you tell me again what those barriers, those man-made barriers are called? I didn't write it down.
Oh, wing dikes.
Thank you.
And then give me a thumbs up. You can do it on your screen or in the taskbar. You've gotten to a good spot. All right. Would anyone like to describe their food web or show it to us?
Mine's not very pretty.
Laura, you're an artist.
Doesn't matter. I build stuff.
What were some things that you thought of making connections to?
Well, I was curious what a scraper is. Um, I have a lot of questions about what the different things are, but I kind of understand the basics, that the leaves and sticks are broken down by the shredders. The predators are eating insects, the other insects, and things that are alive.
Yes,
Not all
you're
I
just kind of connecting the energy flow between those. Yeah, scrapers, if you spent much time turning over rocks in a creek, can often be found on the other side in sort of like the most beautiful little rock casings. So that's what that is. And then the head and arms are hanging out the front, and then they sort of walk around the bottom of the creeks and rivers in their little homemade houses.
If I might jump in, Kristen, those are the macroinvertebrates that we collect when we go out in the creek with Blue River Watershed Association and with Friends of the Call. The scrapers are the caddisflies. And they're high quality. They're good bugs. They need lots of oxygen. So when we see them, we're pleased that the stream is healthy.
I've even seen artists take their little homes and give them, an aquarium, certain rocks to build their little houses out of, and then people wear them as jewelry, which is pretty clever to get insects to make your art for you. So, and kind of looking at the model that you just drew of the Missouri River food web, I want you to go ahead and take a look at some of the models that scientists have taken into account when thinking about big river food webs. So go ahead and read through these 3 different models and correlate some of the text to the diagram next to them. And then once you've made it through, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Cool, thanks, John. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Nicole. So kind of after studying this material, I want you to redraw your food web to incorporate this new information. what were some things that you maybe corrected or maybe emphasized more or added or subtracted?
Yeah, can you? I added a river.
Ooh. So
Yeah.
did anyone else add the river or more landscape? Yeah, so it's interesting to think about, often food webs as a model are sort of this like suspended thing in air on paper that often don't take into account the landscape around them as kind of the full picture. Is there anything else that came up?
Well, what I got just from this really simplified was that sticks and leaves feed the river and the river feeds other organisms. Like really basic.
Yeah. So to kind of think about big river food webs is a little different than maybe in the context that we think about them on smaller streams or tributaries of bigger rivers. I want you to think about what happens to river food webs in general when connections to the land change by human activity. And we're going to do this in breakout rooms. And breakout rooms are just a way that Zoom allows us to have small discussions. So I'm going to assign you a room, and you might need to click a button to move over to that room, or you might automatically move there. So just give me a second here. But remember this question: what happens to river food webs when connections to the land are changed by human activity?
Mhm.
So,
Hi, you guys.
Hello.
hi,
No, Kristen, what school are you at?
Trail Ridge.
Okay. And Nicole, you're at Indian Ridge?
Hills.
Hills. Okay. There's 2 schools with the name Indian, right?
hmm
That's conveniently confusing.
It is. My husband still gets them confused.
You're like, I am at my school to pick up the kids. You go to the wrong place. So what were some things that you guys were discussing?
We both agreed that the food web would be either interrupted or disrupted, or the balance would be thrown off. That kind of the existing balance would not continue to exist with human activity, whether
Mhm.
that's through like those not dams, but the ones that go halfway across the river.
The wing dikes.
Yes, the wing dikes that whether it's for our gain or it's pollution or whatever it is, that they're either going to have to adapt to the situation or find a new place or just won't survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting, thinking about those 3 different models, the interconnectedness of this watershed system. Each of those models can be happening on a different part of the river and also on the same part of the river all at the same time. The amount of interconnection, even though thousands of miles apart from the source of the river to where it eventually dumps into the Gulf of Mexico, is something that, like, just the sheer power is kind of hard to wrap your mind around.
We got brought back quicker than the 52-second warning.
No, I couldn't find that warning.
Oh,
Well, you can set like a 60-second timer, but it didn't give me that option.
yeah. Yeah, we were just talking, was it John that mentioned? Was it you that was in my chat room?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were talking about people and farm
Oh,
chemicals.
no, that wasn't me.
No, that wasn't you.
David Case.
David. All right. But yeah, I was thinking in terms of thinking about, as an environmental educator, I've noticed over the years that sometimes we take human beings out of the food web, and I'm wondering why we do that. Because we're kind of part of it too, and it's kind of a paradigm shift to switch yourself back into it again.
Hmm. Yeah, that is kind of an interesting aspect.
Yeah. So when we change that food web, even with it affects, like, I think, well, it definitely affects the Gulf of Mexico, which affects the economics of the entire human activity. It can change like what's in our food, how polluted it is, like what we're eating.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, anyway, I'll be quiet.
Yeah, so kind of that connection of water quality and the purposes that we use it for, and human needs can often be related to habitat or wildlife needs.
I think also the fertility of the soil is impacted by the lack of floodwaters running up onto the land. That's been the last few years have been the exception. We've definitely had flooding, but is it a positive? Is that it's not it's an over flooding. It's not a natural pulsing of the river that the river's used to. It's a dumping of a lot of sludge and thick silt onto the land that is different than the pattern that's been there previously, pre-development.
Yeah, and a really good metaphor that I've heard for sort of describing that change in the pattern is that flooding and the river itself had, a natural heartbeat, a rhythm and flow to it. And with the changes of structure, the dams and levees and channelization and loss of habitat has kind of resulted in the river sort of having that same pulse, but then we have heart attacks, which are these massive, destructive and sort of devastating flood events. And not to say that those didn't happen before, but they're at a much more rate of intensity and damage, sort of as that rhythm isn't really there as much as it was previously. Are there other things that came up in discussion?
We talked about fertilizer and how it affects what's going on in the river.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, just because, you dump fertilizer in there and it makes microbes grow, and things that shouldn't grow start growing, and that overtakes a lot of things that should be growing. So.
Definitely. So kind of, plugging back into that water quality. which definitely, affects our local watershed just as much as our global watershed. So since the beginning of river commerce in the 1800s, the Missouri River has been severely polluted and its water quality degraded by human activity. Heavy rains, snow belts have washed massive amounts of nutrients, which get put onto agricultural land, like nitrogen or phosphorus, get used in sewage treatment plants, and those then dump into small tributaries, which then can lead to the Missouri River, to the Mississippi River, and into the Gulf of Mexico. So to kind of, zoom out and to have a different perspective, see what I did there? We're on Zoom and we're zooming. That was my 2 cents at trying to be funny over virtual learning. So once this water reaches the Gulf of Mexico, these nutrients, which are used for plants or cropland land, can trigger algae blooms, which often chokes off oxygen in the water. It makes it very difficult or nearly impossible for marine life to survive, and have resulted in these places called dead zones. And algae blooms can differ from year to year, whether that has to do with runoff or even wind, or even natural disasters like hurricanes can change these algae blooms. But scientists have estimated that the dead zone has cost the U.S. the U.S. seafood and tourism industry nearly 82 million over a year. And for the past 5 years, the average size of the dead zone is around 6,000 square miles. So places like this, seem to be disconnected in our minds in a lot of ways, as that is something that happens not in our backyard, but in someone else's. But the reality of our interconnection that we share within a watershed is really, truly, you pull on one string and it's tied to 5 others. And so even when we think about sediment in the Missouri River is contributing to the dead zone in a way as well. That lack of sediment has made the water so that it's more transparent. So you have higher levels of photosynthesis that's happening, which also aid in these algae blooms. And so when you sort of start to look at one piece, like I was saying before, it tugs on another. And really, it's time that, we take a fresh look at the way that we manage our large rivers in the gulfs and in the bay in which they flow. And as we've seen, dams and levees alone don't often solve problems of flooding and the impact that they have in the Gulf, but by managing nutrients more effectively in farm fields and in our urban areas, and by restoring wetlands and riparian systems that can capture this nutrients and reduce that runoff, that we can start to reduce the size of this dead zone in our Gulf. And scientists hope that we can reduce the average size by around 1,900 square miles or smaller by 2035. And that seems like a long ways off, but the reality of the picture that we're looking at here is so massive. The ways that we have to reduce our impact take a lot of work and take a lot of collaboration. And I think as teachers, you have the ability to foster science literacy and also the skill of observation and collaboration as well. And then the more that we can connect, these NGSS practices into our classroom, and the more that we can begin to be careful and attentive observers of our natural world, we can start to think about our understanding of nature and its interconnectedness on a different level. So often, something that we notice can transpire into wonder and curiosity and lead to some of the most interesting questions. And as a result, further our exploration and investigation. And, I'm not saying that I think everyone needs to run off and become a scientist, but I think that the more that we can grasp our interconnections and dependence on our natural world around us into the different jobs that our young people can grow into, the more that we can build sort of the next generation of stewards. Joan, do you have anything that you might want to add as the sustainability coordinator for the district?
I just think by taking our students outside, by taking teachers outside and saying out loud, that's an important practice. It's something we value, opens the door to learning and a career path, perhaps even for students that they might not have otherwise considered.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, I think we're disappointed that we weren't able to take the 6th grade or the 7th grade teachers out on the river this spring, because it does change perspective. And I know those of you who were able to participate in this workshop before, it's just a whole different perspective to see the city and the river and the connections up and down the river. We go from drinking water plant to wastewater outfall to downtown Kansas City, to the confluence with the Kansas River, and to the Hawthorne Power Plant and the Blue River, where we live, many of us in the Blue River watershed, which empties into the Missouri River east of downtown. It's a great way to show indeed that we are all connected. What we do in our own little square patch of the earth, in our own backyard, has a huge impact on the rest of the world, and that every student, every child can make a difference, and we can hand them the tools to help them understand that.
Yeah. So I'm kind of.
Can I say a little something also before we move on? So the on with the watershed quality and stuff, I think anytime you talk about trying to change, like the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, make it smaller, you immediately try to problem solve. Well, who needs to change? What needs to change? And I often hear it well, farmers need to use this, or cows and pigs and all this. And then, but I also want to point out that it also happens in our cities with what we put on our yards. And so my point being that when we have this conversation, it's really important to include everybody in the solution and to make sure that everybody is taking responsibility for their actions first and then moving outward from there, because we're all in this together. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, Joan and Laura. So I'm kind of reflecting on this workshop. I want to transition to thinking about, what this looks like in your classrooms. So we're going to move into breakout rooms again. And I want you to think about these 2 questions. What are useful takeaways or insights from this workshop or your discussions? And what's something you're curious to learn more about? What do you want to follow up on afterwards? So I'm going to go ahead and move you in breakout rooms again.
Can you leave the questions up in the breakout room, or did they just go away?
They do go away, but I will broadcast them to everyone in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
remarkable. So it's really cool to see how those come together. And using something like this, I was even going to ask like if there was like a virtual field trip that takes you to like those different, like a walk down the Missouri River or something. I don't know, but
It's a great question for Kristen.
hi, Kristen.
So one of our school districts we work with in Missouri is funding us to create a virtual field trip. And so we are, there's been a ton of different quality virtual field trips out there and circulating. So we've been kind of lucky enough to have one of our founders as a videographer. So
Cool.
he is, at the end of this month, we're going out on our boat, and it's big enough that we can socially distance on it, but we'll be able to use professional sound, lighting, and video. And it's been something we've always wanted to do because, people have different abilities to take field trips or even come out onto the river in one of our boats. And so it will be like a tour, like I hope that in this video you can feel the river AC and the wind in your hair. So that's something that we're working on, and hopefully that you could use in the fall in your classrooms.
That'd be awesome.
But there's nothing that is like actually going out on the river. So maybe it will be one of those things where you get a taste of it, and it gives you that extra zap of like, I want to know what this is really like. And yeah.
It's my understanding too, Kristen, that we do have a field trip scheduled in the fall for 6th grade, a contingent of 6th grade teachers. We're not able to take everyone, but we've had some funding issues, as you can well imagine. All this work is funded by the City of Overland Park and Johnson County Stormwater Management District. And so we've identified a little bit of funding this year. We're hoping that Overland Park and Johnson County will come through again next year and help us with these opportunities. And if not, we will be exploring other funding sources. But right now we do have a field trip on the books for 6th grade teachers this fall to do that, exactly that, go up and down the river and see how the river connects. Mm-hmm. And it's just an amazing experience to be on the river in a boat.
Will they send us that information, Joan, when that comes out? Or
yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yes. Yeah. It's our intention to take teachers out every year, and then we're also looking at maybe doing it as a larger workshop. We're in conversation with Missouri River Relief and getting 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teachers out at the same time, so that people don't have to wait every 3rd year. Mm-hmm. To get the experience, because we feel like it does give context to what goes on in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. We studied the Grand Canyon this year in 6th grade, and I was going to go over spring break, and it got canceled. And I was so bummed, just to be able to say, I went, and here's what I see in my perspective, and share that with the students. So I was hopeful, but now I'm like, hey, there's another opportunity that's more local. Yeah. To do a similar thing.
Yeah.
Great.
John Kashka, did you want to jump in?
No, it all sounds really good. We did a little bit this year, just studying water quality, and we go to Wildwood, so I took advantage of that, and we go to their lagoons to see how they do their water treatment and then put it back in. So that's kind of cool to see the kids at first they're grossed out by it, and then when they realize how clean it is when it goes back in, they're pretty amazed that little bacteria and microbes can do all that.
Uh-huh.
That's a valuable experience.
Do they use microbes? Do they use any UV lighting or anything like that, or?
Well, they are self-contained ponds, so it goes through their step ponds, so it goes from one pond to the next pond to the next pond naturally. So it just it's really a cool setup, and it's been like that for years and years and years, using the same ponds, and it just, when it goes out, it's completely clear and clean. And then the first pond, there's nothing living, but by the end, there's frogs and tadpoles and fish and everything, and it's just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a place like that on the Missouri River in Columbia, Missouri. called Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area, and all of Columbia's wastewater treatment water flows through these ponds, which have created incredible habitat for migratory birds. We've been going there a lot. I have a 4-month-old daughter, and so it's a really nice, easy trip to take in the car.
Yeah, I've been there. That is a fun place. That is very cool.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. I'm going to go ahead and close the rooms. So I hope that your conversations were rewarding and helpful in kind of our brief 75 minutes together. I kind of want to wrap up with a few things. The PowerPoint slides, the photos that I showed you, and the lesson plans, including the food web and the I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of, are all things that we're going to make available to you. If you can find the chat box, which is in either the top or bottom bar of your screen, and you might have to click the 3 dots that say more, and that will open up your chat, and go ahead and send us your email address. And Laura's going to help me out and cut and paste those into a document, and then we can email you the resources. Joan might also have a way for us to connect, but this will at least make sure that the folks on this workshop call can get the resources. Now, I know this workshop was presented in the context of connecting your students, but I want you to also know that this is an invitation for you to also personally explore the Missouri River in your own backyard. There is a great company that you can rent a canoe with and take a little boat ride down the Missouri River. And then come this fall, we are going to be hosting a workshop, fingers crossed, on the Missouri River for 6th grade teachers. And Joan was saying that that information will go out this fall. We've been taking out Shawnee Mission teachers out on the river for the past 2 years and have just been really grateful for that experience. Now, with that being said, that is really normally the landscape we tend to work in. You know, we've dealt with, you know, hunkering under bridges during thunderstorms and you know, canceling because of flooding, and we've had Asian carp jump into our boat. You know, you name it, it's been thrown our way. But this is really a first for us to host teacher professional development in a virtual way. And so it's a new territory, and it's something that I would really appreciate getting your feedback on, so that as we do more things like this, we can meet the needs of our teachers. So there is a link in this slide. I'm unsure about its clickability for you, but it will go out in the email that we follow up with the resources. So I'd really appreciate if you guys were able to take some time. And I really did try to make it simple. So it is, you know, multi-choice. And if you want to give us some feedback on specific things, there is space to do that. So lastly, I would like to invite you to either take a look at your window at this storm that's coming through, or to close your eyes, or to look at this beautiful painting by Brian Haynes. And Laura is going to share a closing poem that was written for you by our fleet manager, John Brady.
All right. So the poem is called To Learn the River. How did I learn over the years the music a river brings to my ears? What showed me best which way to go? What clues became the ones to know? It was not by memorization done, not by facts eaten one by one. The river's story is bound by these, but hidden deep and hard to see. I had not then the means to see the gifts the water brought to me, an observation taught of place and time, I learned the water's hidden rhyme. Once taught the tools to hear and see, truths appeared from mystery. As songs of seasons rolled ashore, each insight led me on to more. As I have come to understand, childhood learning fed the man, lessons seen as well as heard, taught more fully than the words. So wherein doth the lesson lie to teach a child about the sky, or oceans, heavens, or the mind, without leaving words behind? Can words describe holding a fish, or flowers, or a petri dish? Can a picture strive to declaim how a river got its name? As a scar holds the lesson of the heat, the path will teach up through the feet. The sight, sound, and feel engrave upon the mind what's best to save. To go there and to see that gives an idea's bones more fat, which with a promise that there is more will make the learning less a chore. This will to know engendered so will learn the river even though its secrets hide deep down below. To learn the river, one must go. Thanks, Kristen. That's an awesome poem by John Brady.
Mhm. So thank you so much for everyone's participation. Happy Teacher Appreciation Week. I really feel like, Teacher Appreciation Week should be every day though. You guys have one of the hardest jobs. And I know that, next school year is going to be a challenge. And I want you to know that we are a resource. So if there's anything that we can do to be of any assistance or take anything off of your load, please feel free to reach out. Here's our contact information. We will be coming out with a virtual field trip for you to be able to use in your classroom. And then we're also coming out with lesson plans called Missouri River Detectives that will pose a question that can be a resource for students learning at home, but can also be used in the classroom. So we are pretty active on Facebook, and that is also a great place to connect with us at Missouri River Relief. Laura and I will be sticking around for a little bit here for any questions. So want to say bye everybody and good luck, and we'll be here for any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.